Okay, let's get started. My name is Olivier Laurent. I'm a photo editor on the foreign desk at the Washington Post. I will be moderating this discussion with Salwan Georges, staff photographer at the Washington Post, who just came back from a trip in Iraq, and Louisa Loveluck, who is our Baghdad bureau chief for the Washington Post and has been a journalist in the region for the past 12 years, something like this, I believe. Louisa.
Yes.
Yeah.
12 sounds more authoritative.
So the discussion today is going to be centered around one photo project that Salwan did in Iraq, a personal story. But we will also be using this work to talk a little bit more about the 20th anniversary of the US invasion in Iraq and the legacy of that intervention. So this kind of discussion, I like them to be fluid. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask them in the chat. I will be communicating them to our panelists, Salwan and Louisa, anytime, don't hesitate. So I'll just get started with Salwan. If you could tell us a little bit first about your own personal story, how you became a photographer, staff photographer at the Washington Post.
Yeah, hi everyone, welcome. After leaving Iraq at a young age, I wanted to tell my family story, as well as many of the immigrant and refugees who left Iraq, left Syria, left many countries that's facing a lot of war and violence. And I started this project after kind of like long-term project, as well as the recent story about the sea, as well as getting into photojournalism after a lot of my family members were getting killed or forced to leave Iraq because of after the US invasion, after ISIS violence, and when uncle.
But back up a little bit, like you hint at the fact that so you're Iraqi.
Yeah, I'm Iraqi.
So so tell us a little bit about how did an Iraqi become a staff photographer at the Washington Post? Like how did you leave Iraq and got to the US in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, my family, like many others, had to flood Iraq after the years of sanctions by the US, where we couldn't even simply have fresh milk. We had to use powder milk, and barely any electricity. We would have like maybe 2 hours of electricity a day. It wasn't a livable country, facing a lot of problems. So we fled to Syria and then took refugee there. And then after years, 5 years, we made it to Detroit. And that's where I started my career and kind of love for photography and telling family stories. Then later, made it to the Washington Post in 2017. I may be the first Iraqi to join a newspaper as a staff, which is an honor for my people, as well as help me tell my people's story in a better way than since the invasion and the years before. So going back was like an honor for me, and I can't wait to share more during this discussion about what I saw there. Okay,
so you mentioned briefly this personal project. Before we get to the chapter about Iraq and this trip that you took to Iraq, tell us a little bit about the details of that personal project. You hinted at the fact of the reason why you wanted to do it, but how did you do it, and what were you showing in that personal project?
So the personal project started years and years ago. It started back when the first iPhone came out, and I wanted to continue shooting with my phone because I wanted to be present with my family. As you know, we live in a very digital world, and everyone is on their phone, and I didn't want to have my camera around me. I wanted to have my phone to be more natural around relatives. And after losing members due to the war and violence, I decided documenting my family, documenting things I see every day. And then since then to this point, I went back to Iraq, and I wanted to tell the same story, keep the same vision I have for this hopefully book in the future. And And when I got to Iraq, it all hit me like finally felt it's a place I belong.
Okay, so I'm going to show some of the photos that you took on that project. They'll be flowing as we continue to discuss. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the first impression that you have when you arrived in Iraq. Like, just to confirm to the people listening to us, that was your first trip back to Iraq in how many years?
So I left in 1998, and it's been almost like 24 years, and I have not been back to my country. The country I know was through books, through stories, through family, through shows on YouTube sometimes, as we are overseas. When I got there, it was a huge relief. I was looking for an opportunity to kind of be able to see my country again, to be able to have those memories that I didn't have an opportunity to live, and I've forgotten them because I left when I was 8. So going back, seeing my old home, my old school, a lot of the neighborhoods where I grew up, it was really an amazing feeling to be able to kind of finally have that kind of closure, to be able to reconnect with my roots.
How was the atmosphere in Iraq itself, like in 2023, after everything that happened? What do you like? What was your impression of the mood there?
I think from watching afar and then seeing it in my firsthand, the country is definitely not what I remember. It's not the same. I think the violence that was unleashed after the U.S. invasion, as well as the ISIS and years of different kind of conflicts, religious war, of course, it has really reshaped and changed the country to a way that's I don't recognize it that much, the places, because it has almost double in population. Life is harder on Iraqis right now. Maybe back in the day, there were some like electricity or something. Now there's electricity, but through generators, and those generators are polluting the air to an extent that my colleague Louisa and I, we had to use an inhaler to be able to breathe there if you're not used to there. So I can only imagine what a kid growing up right now in Iraq would feel to be able to go to school, to be think this is normal, to be in this kind of polluted environment. And unfortunately, not much is being done to help these people. The only thing that I felt when I was there, it was the love of the Iraqis. That thing never changed. The people around me, with me, that made me feel like at home. It made me feel like no matter the distraction, no matter how much they're trying to ruin my country, my people still made me feel like I belong there.
Okay. We're going to delve deeper into your personal project and those photos soon, but I wanted to ask Louisa a little bit about this political situation in Iraq. The fact that you've been in this country, you've been reporting from this country for years now, and you've seen the evolution, the post-US invasion, and then a few years back, the youth protests. Like, can you tell us a little bit about how the mood in Iraq and Baghdad has changed over these past few years?
But I think it's it's interesting, Salwan says that he left a country that wasn't livable. And you spin forward to 2023 and it looks very different, right? Life is not as it was under sanctions. But at the same time, now 20 years after the invasion, there are all these other ways in which it's not livable, right? You can buy food in the shops, but as Salwan says, there is not electricity. The water isn't drinkable. The air is, frankly, toxic. And so when you think about the situation for the youth, this is 3 years after they had this mass uprising where they really, for the first time, tried to sort of take their future into their own hands. There isn't open violence on the street. So there should be this, I suppose, this space for progress, this space for people to start living a dignified life. And that is what hasn't happened because of the way that the political system has developed. what happened after 2003, you know, the Americans spoke of regime change. That was what they said they were doing. They were going in to remove Saddam, and then the quote from George W. Bush was about how they were coming to liberate and to free Iraqis. They didn't do regime change. What they actually did was total, I mean, they decimated the state. The process of de-Baathification basically involved removing civil servants from all of the upper echelons of the state, which means that the generation that we see now who are in the youth protests and, you know, who are all over Iraq, they've grown up with an education system and a health system and all these other systems that were totally decimated in 2003. They were already doing pretty badly under sanctions, but any expertise that existed pretty much was taken out. And in the years that followed, what has replaced what was taken out is fundamentally incredibly corrupt, never really has the money spent on it that it's meant to. Public institutions have been gutted. It's hard to get a job without a bribe. It's a pretty dire situation for them, even if, you know, you see in these photos, there's not really any violence out on the streets in the sense of open conflict, but that doesn't make life good or really particularly dignified.
And a few years back, like just before the pandemic, you had this youth uprising, like against that corruption and against that failed political and societal like structure. Can you, like, you witnessed those protests? Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, again, for this generation, the one thing they've never had is control. Going back to the rhetoric of the Americans and what was meant to happen, you know, the one thing they didn't get was a real democracy. The one thing they didn't get was choice over their future. First, it was Saddam controlling things, then it was the Americans, then it was the sectarian militias, then ISIS, etc. And in 2019, small-scale protests that were pretty normal on October 1st were fired upon by riot police. And all of a sudden, really, it was like the dam had burst. These youth protesters came to Tahrir Square in Baghdad and to squares across the mostly Shiite south of the country, and they stayed. And what had begun as a sort of small-scale cry against corruption turned into a revolt against the entire system. When you read the media, particularly when I moved to Iraq, I was very, you're very aware that when you read news stories about Iraq, it's always about who is Sunni, who is Shia, who is Christian. These were categories that the media really liked to sort of emphasize, to sort of as if it said a lot about a person. But what happened in these protests where people were saying no, sectarianism in particular was imposed on them after 2003, and they are sick and tired of being identified as this group or the other. The biggest division in society at this stage is the sort of elite against the people, particularly the youth. And they sang and they danced and they called for the overthrow of the entire system. And really it posed something of an existential challenge to a system that was incredibly strong. And to fight back, as the system did, it showed how resilient it was. And, I've covered a lot of street protests in my time working in the Middle East, and it was probably the single most violent, or one of the most violent crackdowns against street protesters that I have seen in countries that didn't go to war. Even us, we were riding in ambulances that were picking up wounded protesters and we were fired upon. Protesters were kidnapped nearly every day. They had stun grenades fired literally into their heads. It was remarkably violent, and by the end almost 600 people were killed, 20,000 people were wounded. And this generation that had tried so hard to say no, this is our time, we want our future. I think a lot of them realized that the system that had grown up with them, this political system, was stronger, and ultimately it prevailed.
Yeah, and I'm sure that the pandemic and all the lockdown did not help that movement.
Yeah, not at all. I mean, the interesting thing you get is you have this sense of hope that people had in 2019. For a brief period, it really seemed like things they hoped could be better. People were standing shoulder to shoulder and they were together. And the protests sort of wound down in stages, but the time that they finally were cleared was with COVID. And so people had gone, the people who had held out had gone from being all together, all in this square, to being stuck inside their homes, completely unable to go out, going through this, this pandemic with the world. And I think it really contributed to a very serious depression among a lot of them. People talk about the failure, maybe the short-term failure of this movement as akin to heartbreak, this crushing sense that they had tried so hard and they had believed so much, and suddenly they're all stuck in their homes. They can't go out, they can't see each other. People stop texting each other because they feel too down or depressed. And I think for a lot of them, there is now a question about not what it is to be Iraqi, but what it is to be citizens in their country, after really seeing the reality of the power structures made manifest, the post-2003 power structures. These are ones which were created and imposed by the Americans, and what it is to live there now.
And I think that's like what you just said, like it's a good segue back to Salwan. Like this is his first time you're coming back to your native country after 25 years. And so photos that we're seeing is your exploration of that country and what it means to be Iraqi. Can you tell us a little, like, can you go through your feelings as you're rediscovering Baghdad, where you were born?
I mean, I went through a lot of emotions and a lot of feelings as I'm going through, like almost like back in history, back in time. A lot of the times when I see Iraq on the news, or as see my colleagues, Louisa, Mustafa, Osama, work hard in Baghdad, risk their life. I had always a calling, like I want to go back in my country and help and see, but I never had the opportunity until now. And when I finally went back, I mean, I didn't realize how much I was attached and how much that place is part of me and who I am, as I was taken away from it really early age. But now, like, I'm back there, and I can, it's the first place where I'm walking down the street and everybody's speaking my language. It's the first place I wake up in the morning, I'm hearing Iraqi outside my window, not like any different countries where I do my job. It's a feeling that I don't think anyone can, like, I cannot describe it, and it's hard to describe it unless you live through it. So being there, being able to walk down the street, as I said, and and communicate with people in a way, no matter what country I am or I speak English or the language, is you always feel like you don't belong there. That's not where you're supposed to be from. I know Iraq has changed, but for me, as I went through many hard times there during my last trip, like seeing the grave of my grandpa destroyed by military as they were searching for weapons, as I was finding the same exact site where my uncle was killed by a car bomb. It was more of a reaching a closure for me, and also saying goodbye to the past as I move forward. And when I go back, I hope to create new memories. I hope to be smiling like in this picture with my mom. As I see a lot of hope was taken away from Iraqis, a lot of hard time they went through. Iraqis, we have a thing, we always joke on our situation, and that never changed. Like the love to live was always there. And when I got there and was around my friends or my colleagues, it's really made me feel that as hard as they tried to take that away from us, they were still standing, and people kept who they are. So
like the name of this discussion is how I did it, and
this
wondering, like,
I did it with this.
but like I'm like wondering about you know, when you've been away from your own country for almost 24 years, and you're going back, it's the first time. I'm sure it's very overwhelming. There's a lot to consider. Where do you start? What was the first thing that you decided to do?
So when I first got there, I was picked up by my colleagues Mustafa and Osama, who are based in Iraq and works with Luis and I as our team in Iraq. And I told them, first take me to eat some Iraqi food that I haven't had in so long. It's totally different.
What did you have?
I think we went to some local restaurant and we had a lot of rice and stews and everything. And I also had my favorite desserts, the sit, which is you saw in one of the pictures. All these things, like I've been dreaming about, hoping to try them again, but it's never the same than when you try it in Iraq. So that was the first thing we did. And then as well, and as we talk about the protest and the toll it took and how it crushed a lot of the youth dreams. That was the first place I went to, even before eating or going to that. We drove straight from airport to here, and when I saw it, it was like I couldn't believe I was there. Everything rushed through my head, seeing all these images and clips were coming from my colleagues down there and the people who were there. And I just had to take a moment and pay respect and take take a moment of silence, basically, on all the lives that were lost by evil acts to destroy youth dreams. And then, we can kind of I had a list, but the problem with it is Iraq is not the same because of the population, of how crowded it is. We had to kind of go on a journey, my team and I, trying to hopefully find the homes where I grew up. So we kept moving around, asking people. All I had is the name of a place. Maybe, my school, if I find my school, I'll remember where my house is. And I was shocked to find some of these places are still standing there untouched from the 90s. And we're talking about a country that was destroyed. A lot of it was damaged, destroyed, but they were overgrown. My first home I was born, it was overbuilt. The garden we had is gone. The chicken coop was gone. Everything it's gone. So almost the streets are way narrower now than what it was. And then kept exploring, kept trying to find my home. And then when I found those places that are still there standing, it took me way back. It was there for me to say goodbye. I think that's how I felt.
Yeah, and you mentioned this is a photo of you
that street,
in your home street when you were a kid.
Yeah.
And then in this photo, you're seeing this element of the photo here. And so this is over here. So this is where you were born, right?
Yeah. And I remember my Mustafa and I, our colleague, we kept going back and forth in the street, FaceTime and families. I'm like, do you remember what it was? They were like, yeah, it used to be a factory or an open area down there. I was like, there's no open area. There's more power lines. There's more, homes. Everything is changed. Everything is not the same. But we kept asking, we kept looking until we found those places. And I really felt attached to those places when I got there. Because those places, I didn't have an opportunity to have one last look at them, didn't have the opportunity to have that memory of home, because after that, we kept moving until we found our kind of home in Michigan with my family.
One of the questions being asked is about you being a refugee. How does it inform your photojournalism, that experience? And the question mentions some of the work that you've done in Ukraine, especially that powerful photograph of family saying goodbye at a train station as like they're fleeing the war, and husband has to stay to fight. How did your refugee experience influence you in that moment?
Can we go to the photo of the bus station, please?
Yeah.
So, in Ukraine, was maybe the first war, official war I covered. I've covered different conflicts across the US, overseas, but Ukraine, it was a war that kind of was well, one of the most documented war in the recent history. We had access like nowhere before, and there wasn't a battlefield. Everywhere was a battlefield. So we were around people fleeing for their life, and people were, looking out for their kids, trying to take refuge, watching from the windows. And it took me back when I was taking that picture of Georgie saying goodbye to his wife and kids. It took me back to this place because in the late 90s, my dad put my mom and I on this bus in this area and sent us away. And I remember looking at my dad through the window and wondering like if I'm ever gonna see him again, if I'm ever gonna be able to say goodbye. My dad was standing out there crying, saying goodbye to us. I didn't understand a lot of that, but I remember looking as we drove through the desert from Baghdad to Amman, Jordan. I remember looking away in the distance and wondering, like, was this the last time I'm going to see my dad? Was this the opportunity that, the last opportunity? What's going to happen? Am I going to see him again? So when I was in Ukraine and I was witnessing this moment, I was really, it was really heavy for me, but I had to keep doing my job and I had to really show the world the suffering of these people, even though like once it was mine.
Another question that I'm going to ask, like a version of it to you, Salwan, and then another version to you, Louisa. As you were photographing, like, were people looking at you suspiciously about like, who is this person reporting on us? And Louisa, I want to ask you the same question about like, how you report in Iraq and how, like, especially working for an American publication in a country that was deeply influenced in a lot of negative way by the American invasion. So someone go ahead, and then Louisa. As
I was photographing in Baghdad, correct?
Yeah.
I mean, being from there has definitely given me advantage than, let's say, someone else that comes in and trying to do the work. And also having just my phone in a country that everybody's on their phone, everywhere in the world, everybody's on their phone. It has really helped me kind of be a little bit more invisible. But the thing is with this project, like whenever I was around people, I interacted with people. I was, again, I had a feeling when I was working in Baghdad. It's the first feeling I've had in my career where I'm working in a place that understands me and I understand it. I'm working in an environment that was, I'm very familiar with, even though, it's funny to say that this is my first time going back, but, as I kept, learning about my country. I kept online checking the news. I kept reading the stories that Louisa wrote from Baghdad and my colleagues. So, all that has helped me never lose touch with my country, but it's different when you're there. When you're there, even though the air is terrible, you're still in Baghdad, you feel it. The trees, the palm trees is different. I've been to different Middle Eastern countries. But when I woke up that first morning, and as I was saying, I was hearing Iraqi outside my window, I'm like, whoa, I'm not home, but like, this is weird. I'm hearing my language. And then look outside my window and I saw a palm tree that's like, it's different. It's Iraqi palm tree, it's our palm tree. It's not like in Miami or all the areas where I've been in my life.
I understand. Louisa, for you?
Yeah, I mean, one difference, I suppose, that I've had as a reporter compared to people who have been working in Iraq in some of the earlier periods is that security has just been so much better. So there have been times when I've spoken to people to sort of foreigners like myself who reported at the height of the Civil War, and they, often it was very difficult to move around. We'll talk about neighborhoods or places that we went to, and they're, incredibly surprised that it's possible. But the amazing thing about working in Iraq is that you can kind of pretty much go anywhere and speak to anyone, particularly as there are so many sides. It's so politically divided in so many ways that if one person won't speak to you, then the other person will, particularly when it comes to something like corruption or something else. So, that's definitely an advantage. Working for an American newspaper, and indeed being British, so two forces involved in the invasion of the country.
Talking to everyone, they left me alone. I'm sorry. They didn't know I was in America.
It can be, it can be difficult. People are understandably, or can understandably be suspicious. I started this particular sort of assignment in 2019, and very shortly after President Trump ordered the assassination of one of Iran's most senior generals and a leading Iraqi militia leader outside Baghdad airport, Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, and brought America and Iran nearly to the brink of civil war on Iranian territory. And of course, you have reporters like me in the middle who suddenly it's very hard to get access. It's very hard to get answers from the very people you want to speak to. A lot of these are unbacked groups, because understandably they say, well, why the hell are you calling us? We don't want to speak to you. The Washington Post sounds to many people like state media, and it can be hard to change those perceptions. So by and large, I haven't had any particularly difficult security experiences because of being a foreigner. Frankly, the worst security experiences we've had have been, when we've been with protesters and the riot police have fired on them and by extension on us. But the nationality is something that you have to navigate, and it's understandable. Some people just don't want to speak to you.
And Iraq is very diverse. Like, a lot of people think, oh, there's only Muslims or Christians, but like even with Christians, there's different groups. In Iraqis, there's different groups. Like some of the stories we went, Louisa and I, and certain groups, they speak different than the other Iraqis in the south, and you have to know their tradition. And like, for example, like you go in a room, you have to say hi from the right, not from the left. I mean, all these things, like, if you do any of them, you may have disrespect to them. So like, those cultural things, they may be a little bit difficult, but people are, still have a big heart in Iraq. They're very welcoming.
It's a hugely welcoming country. That's the thing. There is there is both a tradition of hosting, but also, people are incredibly warm, and you really, as a foreigner, you really feel it.
And I think it's also very important to mention how the key role that local staff plays in facilitating your work. Mustafa Salim in Baghdad for us. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's very important that I do not suggest that I'm doing this work alone. I am absolutely not. Yeah. As Salwan has said, Mustafa and Simsim, our driver, Osama, we go around everywhere together. Mustafa is, has been doing this work since 2014. He also has the closest thing I've ever come across to a photographic memory. It's phenomenal. And he has an astonishing way of speaking to everyone, smoothing over situations that I sadly could never smooth over in a million years. The work would be completely impossible without him. Just because I'm, when we say my work, it's not my work, it's our work. And he's a vital component of it. They both are.
Same. For me, they, as soon as I landed, I've speak with people only online or something, And then they adopted me as a brother to them, and we did everything together. And that's the one thing when I went back home, I was never worried about. I was confident in that Iraqis will always be Iraqis with their generosity, welcome, really helping you. And I saw that in so many different scenarios, as you will learn in the story when it publishes. Mustafa and Osama were a huge part of why we were able to do the work we did.
Yeah, and you worked on this personal story that we're seeing the photos, but you also worked with Louisa on a couple of other stories about the coming anniversary of the American invasion in Iraq. One of the questions being asked is how you two work together on the ground when you're tackling like stories of this magnitude.
Louisa.
About to say Salwan. Yeah, I mean, we started this assignment, and halfway through there was an earthquake in Syria and Turkey, so we sort of pivoted there and then returned after
11 days.
11 days to this. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as a print reporter, I've definitely had to learn over time how to work with photographers. Silly as that sounds, I think we often can assume that we just charge around with our pens and that is the most important thing. And it is important, but the best stories are the best collaborations. And, I've had to learn how to give the photographer time as well. And the thing that's lovely about working with Salwan is it's very instinctive. My work involves a lot of sit down interviews. Often they're very static. That is great for me, great for the sort of detailed reporting, but it's not great for a photographer. So, Salwan was very good at kind of sitting down and listening in when he needed to, but also roaming around and ultimately kind of coming back. And I think, looking at the photographs I've seen for the stories that we're publishing in the coming days for the anniversary, it's he knows when to stay and he knows when to roam as such, and it's a gift.
I think like hearing people's story is so important. A lot of times I tell this even to like when I teach photography or when I talk to people, it's so important I know sometimes it's like interviews are boring, but like you don't know the benefit of sitting down and learning and also paying respect to these people, taking the time for you to listen to you and giving you, pouring their life story, talking to you about their suffering. And I learned that, as I grew as a photographer too, the importance of learning about the story, the importance of, giving time when people are talking to you, because, you don't want to charge in, direct it. It's not a movie set, direct everything. Oh, I want to take a picture. Like I've never worked that way. And I hope people don't work that way. And with Luis and I, like as we worked on this other story that you're not seeing the photo, we were literally investigating something that was never done before. It was hard. There's no data, barely anything. And how do you photograph something that happened long time ago? And thankfully with my work through investigative, which is I do a lot of these stories that like, investigate something from 20 years ago or something, you learn how to kind of be creative, learn how to kind of tell a story and know the moment of when something is important that need to be documented. And Louis and we never said, hey, Louisa, I didn't get enough time to photograph something. It all happened naturally. And that's the importance of partnership and trust in each other. And we had an amazing team in Baghdad. Everybody knew what we need. Everybody knew how to get it. And even though it was the assignment, when we first started, we thought it may be impossible. We may need to change the story because there's no data. There's no such a thing that was ever done research on it.
Yeah,
but I think as well, one thing that people who maybe don't work in the industry sort of don't always realize is just how much time a photographer and a writer end up spending together. It's not the case that you do something and then the photographer sort of turns up and clicks the button a few times. With the greatest of respect to my photography colleagues, it is often being together 24/7 for 1 week, 2 weeks. What were we? 3.5? So you end up really getting to know how the other person works. It's really important that you get on with each other. I think it worked well.
And when you met me, it was a week after I've been already in my country. I was over the moon. I was happy. It was like, oh my God, this is home. I'm eating great food. I'm working. I'm fine.
Not jet lag. Yeah.
Yeah. I found 3 of my former homes. I saw my old school, like all these things that I never imagined still exist were there for me. So I was in a really good mood, let's say. And also like sad and frustrated about the situation things were, but getting along is definitely such an important thing. And also, you do the work and in the most ethical and professional way. That's all we can do.
Yeah. One question, a technical question for you, Salwan. Like you mentioned, you used the iPhone. One of the reasons was because you wanted to be present. But can you tell us why you decided to photograph this in black and white and also in square format?
So part of how I learned photography when I started in Detroit, I went to a film school. So I never learned digital photography or color photography. I started in black and white. And through that, I developed my love for, that type of photography, shooting with medium format, which is usually it's a square, and it gives you that kind of look. So when the first project started, I used the phone because, as I said, I wanted to be around my family, but also it was a camera that's always with me as I documented things I'm seeing. I'm not one of those photographers who walk around with a camera around their neck. That's not me. And I just, when I'm working at my camera or with me, like in the bag. But the phone was the easiest way for me to always be present and have that camera with me without really feeling like I'm at work. So my family doesn't yell at me. But the black and white, it just because for my love for black and white photography, which is it was one thing I loved growing up and learning how to do.
And the square format?
The square format comes from shooting in medium format, as well as when Instagram was first released, was all square. And I just kept the look, and I just wanted to clear something. The reason why this looks like this is because it's a continuing body of work from the past 10, 11 years of documenting my family, my life, and things I see every day. And that's why I wanted to keep the look until this last chapter.
Excellent. I'll stop sharing the screen so that people can see your faces a little bit bigger. But we have a few more questions. One, I think, for you, Louisa, about the, you mentioned, both of you, a couple of times already about the air quality in Baghdad, and the fact that this is one of the countries that is the most vulnerable in terms of climate change. In your reporting and in your visits there, have you seen any kind of hopeful signs or project, especially when it relates to water quality? Can be a no.
Off the top of my head, I don't know any, but that is not the same as saying they don't exist. I think it's interesting, we were talking about the youth protests earlier and how, this kind of, for now, this round of revolt is over, the political system is very strong. But then the question becomes, okay, how long can this continue for? And there are these two huge extra strains on Iraq that you sort of don't see quite in the same way elsewhere. One is the demographics. There are 1 million people being born a year, which means that the population is swelling hugely. And then, as you say, it is the 5th most vulnerable country in the world to climate change. Vulnerable being the key word there, right? It's not the case that it is the hottest country in the world. It is the case that it just kind of has so much dysfunction in its political system that it's not really equipped to cope with what it has. And I think there are very real questions, not necessarily in the next 5 years, but in the next 10, 15, whatever, maybe slightly further, what pressures this is going to add to the politicians who at the moment have absolutely zero interest in reforming the system. They, over just 2 terms of one prime minister in the mid 2010s, one estimate was that $551 billion of state resources have been siphoned off. No politician wants to step away from that, but climate change is making people have to leave their land. They're having to pile into the cities. Pressure is rising on that. 1 million people are being born every year. One has to ask, is this going to be one of the things that tips the balance?
And just to add to that, I saw it firsthand compared to what I saw in the 90s. The streets were cleaner in the 90s. The air was cleaner. There were more green spaces. I remember I used to go to this celebration square and watch fireworks, and there'll be clean air. And now it's very rarely to see a green space in Iraq, and that's something that's very disheartening. The traffic is insane. Everybody complaining. It was like, oh, LA has the worst traffic. I was like, imagine going to Iraq, Baghdad. I've never seen anything like this in my life, on top of pollution. So I have no idea what happened there. I kind of know, but it's just I don't know what's going to take to fix it. Hopefully some more honest people up there in a position who really care about Iraqis.
Yeah. Another question that we have is, do Iraqis see and read your reporting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the reporting is published in English, which obviously precludes a vast number of the Iraqi population from reading it, right? But one thing you do see very commonly is translation. It's very frequent that reports in the Washington Post are translated incredibly quickly, and therefore they are basically available in full. I know that there are some publications which take the decision to do the translations themselves, particularly for sort of big and impactful pieces of reporting. And I think, there's really a pretty major case for that going forward, because people are interested. They do want to know. Stories sometimes get picked up in the media. We reported a story at the end of last year about how the former prime minister, who had come to power with significant American backing, had basically overseen a commission which involved the pretty serious torture of a lot of allegedly corrupt businessmen. That was in the media, the Iraqi media, every day for quite a long time, and had impact. So I would say Iraqis can at least read the stories when they are, if they don't speak English, which of course many don't, if they are translated, or if it breaks through. But it is not the case that the sort of product as such is available to them at the point of writing, which is a great shame.
Mm-hmm. A question for you, Salwan. Going back to your personal story, are you, what are your goals? You've been working on this for years now. What's your goal with the whole project?
I'm happy I was able, Olivier, you the first day you started, and when I started, I was like, hey man, I want to go to Iraq, and I have this idea, and this is the last chapter of a book I think I'm working on. And you're like, yeah, let's be patient. Every time I tried to go, something happened in Iraq. The last time we booked everything to go, former President Trump called Soleimani, and then that canceled everything. Iraq changed. And we finally went and did it, and I'm really happy. I couldn't really. It's a book. I couldn't really finish the book without having a conclusion on all the feelings and things I've been thinking of since I started this project. So I hope this project, once it's published, it will be the start of the hard work starts to finally put this book together, put all this work from the past 10 years and longer together, so people can really learn more about my whole story, not just me going back to Baghdad, about how I left Baghdad, about how all of my Iraqi fellow people went through, what they went through, and things like, for example, like things I've seen and experienced even during my work, like, for example, watching at that time former President Clinton ordering, like, you know, some strikes on Baghdad, and seeing that on my own eye as the air defense working to bring down US flights, and then fast forward doing, as you know, I work for the Washington Post, so I do some politics, and here I am standing next to President Clinton. So like, how do you put that to words? So hopefully I can write a chapter about that.
Excellent. We have a few minutes left if there's any other questions coming. I think we have one for Louisa, going back on reporting in Iraq. Is there any impact of you being a woman reporting in Iraq?
Yes and no. I mean, often when you sort of speak to people who maybe haven't visited, don't know very much about the culture, there is sometimes an assumption that it is the fact of me being a woman is something that would make my life more difficult. By and large, that is not the case. My Arabic is very poor, and my I think biggest regret is that as a woman, there are many spaces that could open up to me in a way that many men wouldn't be able to access. You go into any home, and I would always say it with my male colleagues, with the men. The women are all in the back. They're all talking. Half the time they're listening and watching. If I spoke better Arabic, I would be able to go and sit with them, and that whole world would open up. And that is, one of my biggest faults as a reporter, that actually I can't do that. It can be immensely frustrating. But no, I mean, I don't think it. I think in some ways it is an advantage to be a woman. Not to generalize about men, but women are sometimes more empathetic. I think sometimes we look at the world from a slightly different angle, and I think actually in a country where at least the Western media has nearly always focused so heavily on war and spectacular violence, it is actually a benefit to be a woman, and to be someone who comes in maybe with a slightly different set of eyes, I think.
I agree.
No, I completely agree. Like when I see the work of photographers who are working with a male reporter and a woman reporter, like there's a difference in the photography that you get back. And often I had to admit, the work is better when they're working with a woman.
We'll take it.
We have one more question, Salwan, for you. What have you learned from covering trauma, especially when it comes to reflecting on your own and looking into others?
I mean, trauma, it's a good question, because a lot of times, people don't ask about the people who are on the ground. And Louisa was in Ukraine. I was recently in Ukraine and other areas, I'm sure, in life. And a lot of people take that for granted, like health, mental health. And I'm not going to say I was fortunate, because that's not cool, but I grew up in a really, during a hard time. I grew up in a place that was already trauma everywhere, wherever you look. If it's the condition of living in Iraq during the 90s and the sanctions and the country coming out from a war, if the things you see on TV, because as you know, like Middle Eastern TV, like right before they show a cartoon, they may show you a killing. So there's no filter there. Like, you grow up as a kid seeing all that violent, all that around you. So I don't know if that helped me or prepared me, but I know that I take that very serious. And I think the biggest thing is to really listen to yourself when after coming back from those things, and take time and that kind of like really don't, don't always expose yourself to that stuff without really like making sure you're okay, because you don't wanna make a mistake as you are covering these kind of stuff that's like could be deadly, for example. And I'm talking in general. But I've learned a lot covering this stuff, and I've learned a lot through living as I grew up in Iraq and in Detroit as well. It was hard as well. That's what I'm hoping to share in my book, that people think, you know, you come to the US, your life is great, everything, you're the American dream right away in your face, and that's not true. I confirm that through me, through many of my friends, through many of my family members. So you go through a lot of trauma, you go through a lot of stuff. People may grow up in different environment, not everybody exposed to trauma early on, but for me, I've always been serious with it and make sure you're okay, and it's so important.
If I could just add,
yeah, go for it.
We, you know, as I say, we did go to northwest Syria at one stage, and we were reporting a story that was very sensitive and very difficult, and it involved new orphans, you know, children who had very recently lost their mothers and their fathers. And I don't know if it is linked, but I noticed that Salwan, I don't really remember working with children is difficult at the best of times, right? It is so sensitive. You have to be so careful. But you know, we did these interviews with the full consent of the parents, and I think ethically, but Salwan was vital in that reporting. He wasn't just behind the camera. He was very much involved in, you know, the discussions with the children, setting them at ease, kind of understanding when maybe they were being spoken to in a more sort of official register that made them more a bit more anxious. And you know, I don't know if that is related to past trauma, to having seen children go through similar things, to just being a great and empathetic person, but it made the difference between, you know, being able to do that story right and not at all, because if you don't do that, you risk running roughshod over the sort of emotions and possible future trauma of these children. And it was something I really noticed that, you know, Salwan, you were, amazing at it.
Excellent. We're at time, but I want to ask one last question to the both of you, bringing it back to the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. Something that you mentioned at some point, Louisa, in our previous conversation, and through the work that you're doing for this anniversary, but also the work that you've been doing these past few years, and also Salwan, through that personal story, do you feel that Americans have forgotten about the Iraq War?
Yeah.
I mean, have done a lot to Iraq, which is, you know, America's my second home, but it was really hard to watch that and go to Iraq and see it, what the result was. Nothing has improved. It got maybe even worse, and it was like a false dream that was sold to the Iraqi people that turned into a nightmare, and they're still trying to wake up from it.
I think it's a very dark chapter in American history. What happened, in the way that most Americans interact with it, if they interact with it at all, is through knowing, you know, that it got very difficult, it got very dangerous, many soldiers died. And I think the thing that a lot of people don't realize is just the incalculable toll it took on Iraqis then and now. You know, some estimates are much higher, but of the counted, documented deaths among Iraqis, 288 violent deaths in the period after the war and after the civil war that followed. 210 of those were civilians. That means that people are growing up today without mothers, without fathers, without sisters, without brothers. You know, the ramifications of this and the reverberations of it are being felt today. They're very alive. And I don't think most people realize that outside of the country.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Salwan, Louisa, for this discussion. And thank you for everyone that attended. We really appreciate your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.